What's today's date in the United States?
21st of June.
Hey, Keaton. 21st of June in US. Okay. That's here. Good evening. Does it look like we have everybody here?
Yes. Hi, Steve.
Hello. Can I call to order the June 21st and 2nd special meeting of the Louisville Planning Commission?
Hang on, Steve.
Recording in progress.
All right. Let's call to order the June 22nd, 2023 Louisville Planning Commission meeting with a roll call, please.
Alrighty, so Commissioner Howe, we're going to pause for a minute
Here.
on echo. If you do what, sorry? Actually. Okay, we've got a little bit of an echo, but we're going to try to do roll.
Yep.
Okay, so sorry, Commissioner Howe, you said that you were in attendance. Commissioner Krantz?
Here.
Commissioner Baskett?
Here.
Commissioner Moline?
Here.
Commissioner Osterman?
Here.
Commissioner Choi? Is he online? Okay, and then Chair Brown Eyes.
Here. Did you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you, Steve.
Great, thanks. With that then, since it's a special meeting, we'll just move into the presentation.
All right, great. I'm going to log out real quick because I can't figure out how to mute my computer, so I'm just going to have to log out. Sure. Okay, let's see if there's no echo. I got rid of the echo. Sorry about that, everyone. I was just going to do a quick introduction to the project. I had a few slides, so I wanted to hook up, but definitely not necessary. Our consultants have all the really great slides with all the good information. But I just did want to introduce the project and let everybody know that, I think some of you were at the open house last night, some of you weren't. There'll be a lot of the same information from the open house. We had an incredible turnout. I think we had about 80 people at the open house, really great discussions. I just wanted to give an introduction because this is our first meeting as a planning commission to talk about the housing study. So this is, even a couple years ago, we were looking at doing a housing study. We were thinking about the comprehensive plan that's coming up. Since 2017, we've been looking pretty closely at housing policy as a city. We had signed on to a regional strategy for affordable housing starting back in 2017 and, set some goals as a region to try to achieve more affordable housing. As you all know, housing affordability is an issue for our region as well as Louisville. You'll see tonight it seems to be trending not any better, worse as far as affordable housing goes. It's harder for the workforce to live here. It's harder for, people on limited incomes. It's going to be harder to age in place the way things are going. I think all the communities are looking at ways we can improve our housing policies and try to improve the situation and be more inclusive and be more sustainable as a community. Sustainability, it talks about environmental sustainability, economic and social sustainability as well. So to truly be a sustainable community, you have to have all three legs of those stools working together to be a sustainable community. So housing has a lot to do with the equity part, the social part of a sustainable community. So we have a 12% goal here in Boulder County, countywide, to try to achieve 12% affordable housing. That's from deed-restricted housing for very low-income people up to higher income, all the way up through workforce housing. And that our consultants are going to talk about some of those definitions tonight of what that really means. So as a city, as we were thinking about this a couple of years ago, the state actually came out with a grant program, and we were able to get a grant through the Department of Local Affairs. It's called the IHOP grant. It's an innovative housing grant program. It's to promote innovative solutions and develop affordable housing. Many communities around the metro area are doing these housing studies. It helps set up the community to access other funding opportunities, and it also gives us a way to develop policies and strategies and codes that will further our efforts in affordable housing. We were going to do this study. We were going to start the study a while ago, but because of the Marshall Fire, it's a little bit delayed. This does give us an opportunity, though, because as I think you know, we're about to start our comprehensive plan process. That's our 10-year comprehensive plan update. It's a really big deal for the community. It sets policy for many years to come on how we want our community to be over the next 10 years. And so this study is going to lead right into that comprehensive plan. And it's in order to be successful with this study, we're going to set a lot of goals. We're going to talk about a lot of strategies, but we're also going to have to follow up with the adoption of policies and probably the adoption of new ordinances. And I think we need to look at our land uses in the community and see how we can achieve what we want to achieve with this housing study. This housing study is broken into a few phases. The first is the housing needs assessment, which is really where we're at this evening. And Tyler with Echo Northwest is going to be talking about that, and it's very data-driven. But as a community, we need to decide what our needs are for housing as well, so that we can then move on to that comprehensive plan to create those policies. Once we get through the housing needs assessment, we're going to be developing strategies and potential policies and defining what the needs are before we adopt the final plan. So there's a flow chart that you'll see that I had on a graphic too, but I can't bring that up. So I just want to reiterate that this is just the beginning of probably a year and a half conversation, at least, as we go through the housing study and then the comprehensive plan, and kind of work as a community to set our next vision for the next 10 years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our consultants to introduce themselves, and they'll really lead the presentation here this evening.
And it's going to take me a second to. Okay, Keaton and Steve, could you all let me know, can you see the slides? Yes, Keaton, okay, I just saw you nod, awesome.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you so much.
All right, good evening, Chair, members of the commission. My name is Tyler Bump. I'm a project director at Echo Northwest, and we're the consulting firm that's lucky to be working with staff and with you all and with the community on this work. I also want to introduce my colleague, Leanne Ryan, who's the project manager on this project as well. We have another consultant team member that's helping us with the engagement, Logan Simpson, who was here facilitating the open house last night as well, and we'll share some preliminary work that we've been doing on the engagement as well. So next slide, please. Okay, one quick note about the schedule and sort of the series and the timing of this project. We had our kickoff earlier in the spring in April, have been working diligently on the housing needs assessment, which we're going to cover today. Since then, we have been doing community engagement throughout the spring and into the summer and through the fall as well. We'll give a summary of those efforts today shortly. We'll work to develop a draft housing plan, and Rob talked a little bit about how the plan is related to the comprehensive plan. This housing plan is related to the comprehensive plan. And it's really a way to sort of set some big ideas that can be carried forward and implemented through the comprehensive plan. So that draft process will happen, and then we'll move into the final report and recommendations in September. A little bit more about the process here. So today, June 22nd, project overview, H&A findings, the housing needs assessment, which I'll refer to as the H&A throughout the presentation. I've got a series of slides that are really the top high-level findings of that. We'll have a housing needs assessment that's going to have a lot of data and a lot of findings in that will be available to you all and to the public shortly. So for folks that want to dig in a little bit deeper, there's a lot more information in there as well. We'll start to develop our housing strategies and working with you all to talk about what those housing strategies are, what the options are, have some discussion about how those strategies might play out in Louisville, what the opportunities are for those, and then moving forward to the full housing plan for recommendation and forwarding to City Council as well. So we've got a series of meetings with you all and updates over the next few months. Next slide, please. All right, so a quick review of our community engagement to date. Logan Simpson has had one-on-one interviews with 30 folks so far to date to help inform some of the questions and the discussion that we had last night at the open house. As Rob mentioned, we had nearly 80 folks attend last night. It was a very active, participatory environment. It was really fun to see everybody here and get their thoughts out. We had 4 topic roundtables. Folks floated around. Some people stayed at the same tables. Those were focused on sustainability, fiscal position, so some of the discussion around the options and trade-offs related to land use and the fiscal and sort of tax implications of different land use decisions. One table conversation on housing types, and one specifically focused on affordable housing. Some of the sort of preliminary themes that Logan Simpson put together since last night for us today. These themes were, again, based on the activities last night, support generally for mixed use as a type that housing type, development type that people want to see. ADUs, so accessory dwelling units, smaller residential units that are secondary or accessory to a primary structure. Those are smaller, usually under 850 square foot, sort of backyard houses type situations as an ADU, and small scale multifamily. There's pretty broad support for infill and updated development standards to help support infill in a way that works within the context in Louisville. A lot of support for green building techniques and a lot of discussion about TOD and opportunities for location-efficient housing close to transportation, transit, and services. And support for additional density to support affordability. So a lot of talk about how to have housing types and density with the goals of supporting affordability as part of this work. Next slide, please. So one quick overview of the H&A, or the Housing Needs Assessment. The elements that are in the Housing Needs Assessment are on the left-hand side of the screen here. So those elements are community profile. In that we summarize the current conditions of the community from a demographic perspective, changes that have happened over the last 10 years. Household incomes, what is the distribution in household incomes, how has that changed, and how is that related to housing affordability? Housing characteristics, what kind of housing exists in Louisville? How much rental housing, how much single-family housing, how much multifamily housing? Housing market trends, what's been happening with development, what kind of housing is getting built, what is the price point for rental housing, what is the price point for ownership housing, and how has that changed? Housing affordability, diving into what are the thresholds of affordability, what does cost burdening mean, how many cost burdened households exist in Louisville, how does that compare to Boulder County, how does that compare to other jurisdictions throughout the county as well? And then some discussion of Marshall Fire recovery, so continued coordination with staff and community members as more information is available and the recovery process continues to play out as well. The graphic that we have on the screen is one that I always like to share to sort of set up this conversation that we have. And really this just goes to show that there's different housing needs for different cycles of people's lives. We've all lived in very different places, both geographic places and different kinds of housing over our life cycle, and really thinking about the full spectrum of housing needs for members of the community. Not everybody needs the same thing, so just to articulate that there's this diversity of housing needs that exists within a community. Next slide, please. Okay, before I jump in real quick, the other thing, and I mentioned this last night at the open house, that I really value for the housing needs assessment, not just as an existing conditions report, there's a bunch of data to help, technical data to help inform the policies, but to really have a baseline understanding of what's happening in the community so that you all as decision makers and that members of the community have a common understanding of what's happening. What are housing prices right now? How are things changing? How has the community profile changed? So that the community is all working from a common understanding of where we are right now is a really helpful and frankly a powerful way to facilitate a public conversation around housing. So with that, I'll jump into some of this data. And first I want to talk about data sources and some of the information that's on these slides. So Louisville are the yellow bars that you can see there. We've compared across all these data points to other communities in Boulder County specifically. So Superior, Erie, Lafayette, Longmont, Boulder, and then Boulder County comparison as a whole. In this slide, we're looking at total population. Most of our data sources for this information is from the census. And the periods of time that we're comparing things are between 2011 and 2021. And the reason that we're doing that is because 2021 is the most current year of data that's available. And we do like to do a time series comparison. 2011 is kind of a weird year. We were kind of just coming out of the 2008 recession at that period of time. Housing prices were very different in 2011 after the 2008 recession. So it is an interesting sort of comparison for that period of time. Total population in Louisville, about a little over 21,000 people as of 2021. I'll say 2021, sometimes I'll say right now, but it's the most current data that we have available. That's a 14% increase in population since 2011. So a 14% increase in the number of residents in this 10-year period of time. Compared to Boulder County grew about 12%. Other communities like Erie that you can see just have exponentially grown by about 72% over that period of time. But Louisville, generally similar to Longmont, other communities across Boulder County as well. Average age, so Louisville has the oldest median age of all the jurisdictions that we're looking at here. In 2021, the median age was 43 years old, which is an increase since 2011 where the average age was 39 years old. You can see that there's been some increase in the aging population or older households that are moving into communities across Boulder County. And that's a consistent trend across Boulder County and frankly a consistent trend across most of the US and certainly across the West specifically with an aging population that is increasingly getting older. One of the things that we'll talk about as well is the challenging nature of affordability for younger households to move into the community as well. So that's part of it. It's both a aging population as well as a difficulty for younger families and younger individuals to move into the community as well because of housing prices. Next slide. So one note, total households by tenure. Tenure is what we're showing by tenure here is renter households and ownership households. So this slide is 2011, which shows that in 2011, about 73% of the households were owners. So 73% of the households were owners, which means that 27% of the households were renters. Next slide, please. In 2021, that changed a little bit. So the home ownership rate went down. The share of homeowners in the community of all households went down to about 68%. So increasing share of renters over the last 10 years. There's a few different reasons for that. One is the type of housing that could have been built over the last 10-year period. More likely to be multifamily. More multifamily can mean more rentals. Multifamily, as it's built mostly in the US today, is generally rental apartments. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is just the housing affordability challenges for ownership opportunities in general as well, which we'll get to in a little bit. Next slide, please. Average household size in Louisville in 2021 is about 2.5 people per household. Very consistent with the nationwide average, about 2.65 people per household. Larger household size in Erie, smaller household sizes in Boulder. But the household size has increased just a little bit since 2011 in the last 10 years, but stayed pretty close to the same. Household size by tenure. So this is a new slide that wasn't in the presentation last night, just to show the differences between the number of people per household for renter households versus the number of people per household for ownership households. Louisville is the bottom two bars. Renter-occupied households in Louisville, most likely to be single-person or two-person households. Ownership households, more likely to be 2-, 3-, and 4-person households. A lot of that has to do, again, with the housing stock. Ownership is more likely to be single-family housing. Single-family housing tends to be bigger. You tend to have more people in those bigger units. So that is part of that. But when we think about housing needs, we have to think about the needs of both renters and homeowners and owners, and that there's a difference in the size and the type of unit that's needed for different populations, different households. Next slide, please. Living arrangement. This is another new chart that we didn't have last night, but looks at households in Louisville in 2021 and the composition of those households. So the blue color here is couples with children. The orange color is single parent with children, or the sort of light orange color, yellow color. The darker orange color is couples with no children. The gray is households who live with roommates, so roommate situation, might share a house, might share an apartment. And then the purple color is lives alone. You can see that the largest share of household type in Louisville is households with no children, couple with no children. That can be older empty nesters whose children no longer live at home. That can be younger couples that don't have children. It's a wide range of household types that fall within that category. Next slide, please. And then the change. So this is an interesting one to look at as well. So the change in household composition or living arrangement in this 10-year period of time. Louisville has seen an increase, 2% increase in the households that are couples with no children, and a 3% decrease in households that have children. And again, this can be explained for many different reasons. Children leaving, affordability for younger families is a challenge. So less children for different reasons in these households. Okay, one note on household incomes, and this is where it gets a little intense on the trends. Next slide, please. Before I get to household incomes, I want to talk a little bit about employment in Louisville and employment in Boulder County. So total employment in Louisville has, between 2012 and 2021, increased by about 42%. So there's been a large amount of job growth that's happened in Louisville. 10 years ago, folks would sort of think about Louisville as a bedroom community for other job concentrations, job centers, both in Boulder County, as well as other parts of the metro area. But Louisville has seen a pretty steep increase in the amount of jobs and employment that's happening in the community. In 2023, I've pulled some additional information. There's about 17,000 jobs in Louisville in 2023. In 2012, it was about 12,000 jobs. So a pretty big increase in the amount of jobs and employment in the city of Louisville in that period of time. Next slide, please. One other thing to think about with jobs and housing is the relationship to commute patterns. About 15,000 workers come into Louisville to work. The average commute time into Louisville is 16 and a half miles. And it's really important to think about the driving distance and the commute time, especially from a sustainability and a climate perspective. Because if you have folks that aren't able to live or afford to live close to their jobs, people are having to drive further to their jobs, which increases greenhouse gas emissions, VMT, greenhouse gas emissions, and has climate and sustainability impacts. So one of the things that we're trying to do in the housing needs assessment, there will be more information on this, is really understand that relationship between commute and the distance between home and job and what the implications are for sustainability. Next slide, please. Okay, median household incomes. So again, Louisville in the orange has seen a pretty drastic increase in median household incomes over the last 10 years. 50% increase in median household incomes. In 2011, median household income was about $84,000. In 2021, that was about $125,000. So a pretty drastic increase in median household income. You'll see that it was the most intense increase across all the comparison jurisdictions that we're looking at here. About 30%, 35% across some of the other communities. Longmont is the second highest with a 48% increase in median household incomes in that period of time. We also wanted to sort of contextualize this within the context of Boulder County and more updated information from the Boulder County Housing Authority of what they define as 100% median family income. But median income in Boulder County 2023 is $144,000. So that's the median, the middle of households' incomes in Boulder County is $144,000. Next slide, please. Household income distribution, there is a lot of numbers and bars on this. In Louisville, the thing that I want to point out at the top here is that 26%, this is again 2021 household income distribution, 26% of the households in Louisville currently make over $200,000 a year. 15% of the households make between $150,000 and $200,000 a year. So that's the share of the households that are above that median income category. So a lot of higher income households make up a larger share of the community in Louisville. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we want to look at too is the change over time. So how have household incomes changed, median household incomes changed over the last 10 years? And the reason that I pointed out that $200,000 point in the last slide is there's been a large increase in the number of households in that $200,000 a year range, going from about 700 households in 2011 to about 2,200 households in 2021. So a large increase in higher income households, increase in that 150 to 200 category as well. On the flip side of that is a decrease in lower income and moderate income households in Louisville over the last 10 years. And so as we've seen higher income households move into the community, we're seeing less lower income households and less moderate income households. Next slide, please. And then just another way to look at the changes here, the Louisville on the left side, Boulder County on the right, big increase, much bigger increase in those high income household categories than Boulder County as a whole. And the thing that differs between Louisville and Boulder County is that Louisville is losing more households in that moderate middle income band of incomes than Boulder County is as a whole. It's remained pretty flat in Boulder County, but Louisville has seen a big reduction in that $75,000 to $100,000 range, which is moderate income households in Boulder County now. And then also losses in the lower income household categories as well. Next slide, please. Okay, housing characteristics. We'll jump into what the housing stock looks like. Total housing units, about 8,600, 8,700 housing units total in Louisville in 2021. When we look at that change from 2011 to 2021, it was an about 11% increase in the number of housing units that exist in Louisville. But when we account for the housing units that were lost in the fire, it reduces it down about 4.5% increase. So before the fire in 2021, we would have said there was 11% increase in the number of units. But because of the fire impacts, it's changed that number drastically over the last couple of years with the recovery. Next slide, please. Housing mix. So this chart shows the distribution of housing by type, again in Louisville and the comparison jurisdictions. The blue color is single-family detached housing. That orange color is what we're calling plex housing here, but it's anything that from an attached single-family house, so a townhome, to a duplex, to a triplex or a fourplex, row homes, those all fall in that 1 to 4 category as long as they're 4 units or less. Multifamily housing in that darker oranger color, so 5+ units, more attached. And then the gray color is predominantly manufactured homes, but also other housing types as well. Louisville has 67% of the community's housing units in detached single-family housing. 9% of the housing units in plex housing in 1 to 4 units, and 22% in that multifamily category. So a very large share, the vast majority of the housing stock in Louisville is detached single-family homes, which is reflected in the trends in price too, because larger homes, detached single-family homes, have a higher premium associated with them in terms of ownership costs and affordability. On the other side of multifamily too is also the sort of renter need that's oftentimes associated with attached multifamily or apartment units. And there's a relatively lower share of the overall housing in that 22% for renters available in multifamily housing. Next slide, please. And then one quick note on unit type by tenure, the majority of renters, 57% of renters, live in multifamily housing in Louisville. The majority of homeowners, 88%, like we just mentioned, lived in single-family detached housing. Similar rates to the county. You can see the breakdown here on the bottom. Louisville, again, the renter-occupied housing, predominantly in multifamily housing. Only about 28% of renters live in detached single-family homes. And then on the ownership side, you can see there's just not a lot of housing that's not single-family detached in Louisville. That's ownership housing that's not a single-family detached home. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll get into some of the housing market trends, which is our conversation on prices, affordability. Next slide, please. So the average home sales price as of 3 weeks ago when we pulled this data, $831,000 is the average home sales price in Louisville. A household would need to earn 145% of the median family income, or about $209,000 per year to afford the average sales price in Louisville today. So again, to not be cost burdened, to not spend more than 30% of your monthly income on housing costs, you would need to earn $209,000 to afford a house. The chart here, Louisville is the dark black line. You can see just the rapid increase in housing costs and average home ownership price since 2012, about $375,000 in 2012, and again, up to about $831,000 as of 3 weeks ago. Similar trends to the other communities in Boulder County. You can see that same line. There's differences in affordability across the communities. Longmont, for example, has seen the same rate of appreciation, but still remains less expensive, more affordable than Louisville and some of the other communities. On the top, Boulder being the most expensive jurisdiction city in Boulder County from a housing perspective. One of the things that I do want to point out here, though, is the flat line over the last year for Louisville. So prices have remained pretty flat, whereas they've gone down in other jurisdictions in Boulder County. And really, in a lot of other high growth, high cost communities across the West over the last year, because of trends of COVID, if there was a lot of high demand during COVID of people wanting to move to places of high quality of life. Louisville is one of those places that has a high quality of life, good schools, access to natural areas, open space. There was a big push towards folks moving here. That combined with interest rate increases over the last year, housing prices have gone down in most communities that saw really sharp increases over the last 10 years. But in Louisville, they've remained flat. And so to us, that means that there is indicated strong demand, even more so than some of the other jurisdictions in Boulder County that are keeping those prices flat. The other thing that could be happening here is you might have buyers who are less sensitive to interest rate increases, which means folks that have more money in cash or cash down to put down on homes to be able to afford that aren't impacted by the interest rate increases over the last year. Next slide, please. One note on renter versus homeowner incomes. Louisville is on the far left here. Average income for renter household in Louisville is $80,000. Average income for a homeowner household in Louisville is double at $159,000. So a big difference between household incomes for renters and household incomes for owners, which of course has implications for options and housing diversity and housing need for renters versus owners as well. Next slide, please. So similar to the homeownership prices, but not as intense, have been really strong growths or big high increases in housing prices for renters. The average multifamily rent in Louisville in 2023 was just shy of $2,000 a month. There was a 58% increase in the same period of time between 2012 and 2023 in average rent prices. Second highest increase behind Superior in Boulder County. Superior saw an increase of about 60%, so very similar to the 58%. But really, really rapid prices. A household would need to earn 55% median family income, or about $79,000 per year to afford the average rent price of a average rental in market rate rental in Louisville. Next slide, please. One note on cost burdening. So cost burdening is a concept or a definition that Housing HUD, Housing Urban Development, uses to talk about housing affordability. So a household that is cost burdened is a household that spends more than 30% of their average monthly income on housing costs. A household that is severely cost burdened spends more than 50% of their monthly income on housing costs. And so one of the things, the metrics that we look at in terms of housing affordability is how many households in a community are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. In 2021, about 28% of renters were severely cost burdened, so almost a third of renters were spending more than 50% of their monthly income on housing costs, and 13% of those renters were spending more than 30%. One interesting thing about this chart, if you were to look at this and say, you know, in 2011, we had a lot more cost burden renters than we have in 2021, you might say housing affordability has gotten better. We have less cost burden households. But the reality is that there's just less lower income and moderate income households. So you have wealthier, higher income renter households that are here than were here 10 years ago. So while it looks like affordability has gotten better, we've actually seen a reduction in the amount of lower income and moderate income households. Next slide, please. And then one quick note on the Marshall fire recovery. Like I mentioned, we're continuing to work with staff and with the update, the recovery tracker and all the data and information that's coming out of the city and with the county. There's the Urban Land Institute has been doing a technical assistance work project with Superior and Louisville on the Marshall fire recovery, and so we're continuing to integrate some of that work as well. And we'll continue to have those conversations as we get into the strategies and the plan, the draft plan as well. So with that, I think I am done. Questions?
Take it away.
All right. You know, I have a couple. One that comes to mind for me quickly is there any way for you to track the amount of kind of transition in our community? Louisville strikes me as a place where people have sort of come and stayed for a long periods of time. And I'm just curious if there's metrics around how much turnover occurs in our community and whether or not that has any sort of influence on some of the metrics that you're looking at.
That's a great question. I spoke to somebody at the open house yesterday that told me that one of the community survey questions is that question, how long have you lived in Louisville? And so what I want to do is I want to dig into that community survey data a little bit and see how that might relate to some of the data points that we've gotten here as well. Yeah.
I guess my other question was just going to be any conversations around school capacity and what that's has kind of looked at or how that has played into some of our housing stuff. So
I'll take a first stab at it, and then Rob can jump in. We are looking at school capacity, so we got school enrollment data for all of the schools individually and cumulatively across the school district, looking at it, and we are seeing that there's reduced enrollment across all the schools. Rob has some additional information that he could probably share here as well.
Sorry, I'm going to do a little technical thing here too. Try to get us back on the broadcast there.
Clerk's computer.
And just as we're setting up for this, we can just kind of have a free form Q&A at this point between all of us.
So on the school question, and sorry, I was working on that, so I hope I don't repeat too much of what Tyler said. I'm trying to find the slide on school enrollment. You know, when we do residential development, we get school enrollment projections from the Boulder Valley School District planners. And they are, on our last development review that was earlier this year, they're showing decreased enrollment really in all of our schools. That's what's projected. Even before the Marshall Fire, there was, school enrollment was going down in some of our schools, but not all. Now they're looking at, I think, all the schools. There was also a Boulder Daily Camera article a few months ago saying that they were projecting about a 2,000 student, a little over a 2,000 student decrease, just district-wide over the next 5 years. So why is that happening? It's a complex formula. We don't really know all the reasons, why it could be happening. Certainly there's demographic changes. There might be more homeschooling and other reasons. So that's definitely something that needs more investigation.
Sure, thanks so much for the presentation. I just had a question about affordability, and knowing that our goal in Boulder County is 12%, I was wondering if we have any data on the housing supply and how close we are to that goal of 12%.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I don't have the countywide data. So that, what I'm going to do after this meeting is I'm going to send that report, that 2017 report, to the commission. It has some of that countywide data, and it also breaks it down by community. I do know for the city of Louisville, just looking at our housing authority deed restricted properties, we're at about 3%. Of our housing is within the housing authority. There's probably a little bit more affordable housing, even deed restricted affordable housing in the city that's not part of the authority. So it's not anywhere close to the 12%. That report also talks about how do you get to 12%, and the report's goal is 12% by 2035. So we're, that's a little over 10 years from now, and it talks about we're going to have to develop strategies not only to build housing, but also acquire affordable housing. And it talks a lot about ownership programs too. So you don't want to just have, rental programs. You want to have ownership programs as well, where families can build equity. So it's a really great report. It sets a lot of really great goals that we hope to be moving towards. So I will email that to the whole group. I'll probably try to do that here tonight too.
Commissioner Howe, you've had your hand raised for a bit. Whoops, you are muted right now. There we go.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Tyler, and echo Wes. I thought for a visual learner, I thought your graphic information was easy to digest and really easy to understand. So I really appreciate you taking what could have been in slides and putting it in a visual graphic and display. I have lots and lots of thoughts and not ideas, but thoughts and questions, but I'll just narrow it down to two, and then maybe let some other commissioners have their questions too. Can you speculate? I think I know the answer to this, but can you speculate as to the future or expected trends in population and age?
Yes. So one of the things that we will be working on in the housing needs assessment is what does population growth look like, and what does that mean for housing need more broadly over the planning period? So one of the things that we're working on before we finalize our draft housing needs assessment is having a better sense of what that population growth looks like. In terms of the distribution, the trends likely are going to continue. So an increasing share of older households and increasingly higher income households because of the housing affordability challenges. So a lot of the things that we're showing are likely to continue, absent intervention, policy intervention, program intervention to support more moderate income housing and affordable housing.
So just to repeat what you said, you believe that the population, rather the age of Louisville's population will continue to get older, as is the trend right now.
For a while, yes. That's right. And to get back to Commissioner Moline's question earlier, what we heard a lot last night at the open house is that there are a lot of folks that said, you know, I'm in that older cohort category. There's no way that I would have ever been able to afford to live in Louisville had I not bought my house 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And there's a lot of folks that are going to continue to stay here because it's affordable, because they bought their homes 15, 20, 30 years ago.
If I could just ask one more question and then I'll let it go to everybody else. On your slide, the household income distribution, it seems like it's relatively, there are some fluctuations, but relatively stable to within the last 2 to 3 years. And you had touched on this briefly. You talked about COVID and mortgage rates. And I'm trying to think maybe social mobility or ability to work remotely or other ideas that could allow that income distribution to so greatly change over the last few years. What other ideas do you have that has caused that? It's just such a change over a short period of time. And it seems to me like the things that you mentioned are global, national, but we're trying to control this on a local level.
Yep.
So what local factors do you see that contributed to this? And that helps me to understand how we address the problem at a local level.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There have been some intense global shifts that have happened over the last few years. Very thankful to be sitting in a room with other people right now and talking about this in person. Yeah, you know, that's certainly part of it. I think part of the thing too is that Louisville has an extremely high quality of life. It's a really nice place to live. Yeah. The community's great. The schools are great. Those things will continue to exist in Louisville, and that means that people will continue to want to move here. The challenge is that there's very limited supply. There has been not a ton of new housing built in the same period where you've seen a lot of increased demand for that housing, and that has also certainly contributed to housing price increases. And that I think is something that, you know, at the local level and at the sort of recommendation level as part of this plan, there are some opportunities to think about that and where to tailor that specific to those household incomes that have less access to housing in the community today. So there are some things, and that's part of this plan, is to figure out what to do about it, moving into those housing strategies over the late summer and early fall.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Tyler, for those.
Sure.
Any additional questions?
I think we might have some here still, Steve.
All right, great. Please. All I can see is tiny little pictures of y'all. So go ahead.
So this question came up last night at the forum, and I don't know if it's a question for staff or if it's a question for you, Tyler, but we got into discussion at the land use table about implementation. And I'm sorry to leapfrog to that, but go back and forth, fluidity and what we're learning and where we're heading, perhaps. So there was questions about, is it initiative 1, 2, 3? And whether Louis, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to explain what that is, and if Louisville is entering into an agreement with the state to participate in that.
So fill in any of the gaps. You may know some of the more technical stuffs, but let me pull up my slide here too, because I actually had a slide on that. But so Proposition 123 was approved by the voters last year, state level proposition that sets aside state income tax for affordable housing. So I think it was something like 2% of all state income tax gets set aside for affordable housing, and it's in a couple of different buckets. And there's land acquisition buckets and financing buckets for affordable housing projects and all kinds of things. It's, I think it was something like $300 million in the first year they thought could get generated. Hope I'm getting those numbers somewhat close. But how it works is that local communities like Louisville can opt into the program in order to be eligible. So we have to look at our housing stock. There's guidelines about setting baselines. So we have to, based on their definitions of affordable housing, we have to go in and say, we have this much affordable housing at the baseline year. That gives us a 3-year period to work with developers, work with the housing authority, or whoever we can find in partnership to identify and increase our affordable housing 3% per year for that 3-year period. You can opt in this year and try to do 3% per year for 3 years. You can opt in next year and then do 3% for 2 years. So it's a great opportunity to leverage real money with the housing authority or an affordable housing developer in partnership with the city. So there has to be projects in order to leverage that money as well. So that's the key. That's the big part of it. There's lots of other elements of Prop 123 that are to support affordable housing in addition to building housing, but that's the main thing. And if you all have any additional detail.
No, I would just note too that the funding through Prop 123, if a city elects to submit a letter of local government commitment, which has to be done by this fall, for the first year, as Rob mentioned, there's a first-year entry and then there can be a second-year entry. That funding can be spent on a wide range of things. It could be homeownership supports, it could be acquisition, it could be a lot of different things at different income levels. Our preliminary analysis indicates that there's a need there. And so it is a question of how comfortable does the city feel and what is the right time to be able to think about that.
Can I think you want to follow on this, but may I?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Follow on for a second. So is this something that would require council action?
Yes, I believe so. We would have to get council sign off to opt into the program.
And if you don't mind if I follow up on that too. You said that there's about 200 and something affordable units currently based on housing authority data in Louisville, which is about 3%. We have about 3% affordable. So I just want to clarify that I'm understanding this correctly. That would mean if we wanted to take advantage of this Proposition 123 funding, that we would need to add over the next 3 years about 273 units, or I think that's what you had in a different presentation.
Yeah.
I saw that number per year for the next 3 years in order to qualify,
So
bringing us to 9%.
I don't know all, so that 3%, that's deed restricted housing authority run property. When we get into the Prop 123 definition of affordable housing, it's going to be broader than that. There's going to be more units that I think are going to be considered affordable. But it is, you can do, I don't want to get too much into the numbers because I really don't quite understand. It's been a big topic of discussion. The state's actually starting to offer technical assistance for communities because it's really complex on how to figure out that formula. I don't know what the numbers are, but I think it's going to be more than that 200. We might have 300 or 400 affordable units based on the definition and then have to build 3% each year on top of that. So it's 3% of that 400 units each year. It's not a huge amount of units necessarily, if I understand it correctly. I would say that just to get to that 12% goal as well, if we were within our community to have 12% affordable housing, we would have to have something north of 900 units within the city to be at 12% based on our current number of housing units.
So if you don't mind if I follow up just a little bit more on that. I mean, my ears just perk up when you were talking about the numbers because it sounds like this Proposition 123 money is really achievable for us, especially if, like you said, even if we broaden our baseline from saying we have 273 and we include others in that, number that's affordable, wouldn't we then say that we're at a higher percentage? We're at 4%? If you include me, I have a house that I bought a long time ago. But mine's considered, I might consider my house affordable housing if I'm at a certain income and I can afford it, you know? It depends on how you're defining it.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I don't want to get too much into it because I haven't really, dove into the details of how to calculate it. We still need to figure that out. So I don't want to misspeak or give a misrepresentation of how it's defined. But even if you bought your house a while ago, when it was affordable, it's worth a lot more now. So whatever calculation we're going to make, it's going to be based on current market rate. If you were to sell your house today, would it be affordable to a new owner? That's how it's going to get calculated.
Okay, let
Also,
me
one
just
big
say,
clarification there. It sounded like this 3% is of our current stock. I think that's what I heard you say, Rob, not 3% of overall of the city.
So in order to meet the Prop 123 targets, it would be, I believe, 3% of your affordable housing stock. So if we decide, we have 500 affordable housing units as it's defined in the city, we would have to, the first year, and it could be an average over the 3 years. But on an average over those 3 years, we'd have to increase 3% of those 500 units over that 3-year period, year to year. It's not 3% of your entire housing stock.
Great, thanks.
yeah, I understand you don't want to misspeak on this, but I think that this is a really important part of this housing needs assessment, and I hope that we can dive into it more before we come up with our strategy. I'm hoping that this Proposition 123 the data becomes available to us as we move forward with strategy.
Right, yeah,
Strategy.
we will be calculating our baselines, I'm sure, and then that's going to be part of what we have to present to City Council and the state is what is our baseline amount of affordable housing. The needs it's going to be a big part of our strategy, I would anticipate, unless for some reason we decide not to opt in. I imagine we will seriously consider opting in. And then that would become part of our strategy because we're going to have a known resource that we could try to take advantage of. So I think, yes, we need to understand what our baseline amounts of affordable housing are in the city with the needs assessment, but how we take advantage of Prop 123 is a really great strategy discussion as well.
Great. Commissioner Moline.
I might have one more question anyway. So my question is, we've talked about housing in this housing needs assessment, we've isolated Louisville and compared it to the different cities in Boulder County as a whole. And I'm wondering, I think, the Housing Authority study thinks of this as sort of a regional issue and a regional, something that we're going to have to tackle regionally. And I'm just wondering, sort of trying to tie the housing need assessment to that regional issue versus what can we do in this community? And I don't know, would you be willing to talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a complex question, but a really good question. Housing markets are regional.
Yeah.
Somebody has a choice to live in Louisville, or people that have choices that can, have the benefit of having that choice could choose to live in Louisville, could choose to live in Lafayette, could choose to live in Erie. At some extent, there is local decision about what do you want the future of your community to look like, and how does Louisville fit in with that broader housing market. And the choices are, you can make decisions on those choices. Do you want to be a community that wants to think about supporting moderate income workers to be able to live in the community? Teachers, firefighters, local government employees to be able to live in the community or not. And if there's no action and somebody else, another community in Boulder County says, yeah, sure, we'll figure out how to build housing, or we'll build more affordable housing. The housing market is regional, but ultimately it's a question of values, I think, and How does Louisville think about themselves? What's the future? And that's really helpful part of the comp plan too, is,
Yeah.
what are the opportunities? How are we thinking about housing? How do you integrate that vision or those values into the comprehensive plan and make decisions on that from a regulatory standpoint and from a policy standpoint?
Thank you very much. I'm glad, I appreciate what you said, and I remember something you said last night too about, what does a community look like when the people that work here can't afford to live here? And it's kind of those kinds of questions. So I appreciate that. And I also wanted to just say, just really enjoyed your presentation and really just great information and graphics and really, really helpful to understand the needs assessment. So.
On that question of regional level, perhaps Director Zuccaro, are you aware of anything like within DRCOG that's trying to weave together municipalities? It was mentioned that a number of municipalities are pursuing housing needs assessments right now.
Yeah, that's correct. So I think not necessarily through DRCOG, but at the state level through the Department of Local Affairs. A few years ago, they did create this program for this grant program that we're taking advantage of, and there was a subsequent grant program to actually get funding for land or housing that predated this Proposition 123. So most of those efforts, as far as I know, are coming from, I'm sure DRCOG's doing some initiatives, but I'm not really familiar with anything coming out of DRCOG. As some of you also might be familiar, if you were following the state legislature this year, there was a zoning initiative coming out of the legislature that was related to having cities provide affordable housing through different measures. It was really a supply-based standard that they were looking at to try to increase housing supply, which is just one part of it. It didn't really focus on deed restricted type things, but it did have some. It didn't pass if you were following that. But it would have compelled cities to really focus higher density development around transit also, which is really important. To take advantage of that infrastructure and try to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So it was multi-pronged. It was about affordable housing, but broader than that as well.
Great, thank you.
Chair Brown Eyes?
Please.
We have, I don't know if we have people in the room, and I'm wondering if there's going to be time for public comment or questions, or if they'll be able to join our discussion.
So we can do.
I was wondering that too, Director Zuccaro.
Yeah, I would just say, because this is a public meeting, we still have to follow our rules of procedure, and we can do 3-minute public comment periods. And we can certainly offer that as the commission and what we would typically do.
All right, great. Then if the commission is okay with it, maybe we can open up public comment right now then. Asking people to fill out a speaker card if you're in person, and then if you're online, using the *9 if you're on the phone, or raise hand if you're on the video. Limiting yourself to 3 minutes, and indicating your name and the city that you live in when you come up to speak.
Okay, we have a comment card from Sherry Summer.
Sherry Summer, 910 South Palisade Court. So this is a needs assessment, but I'd like to speak about some hidden assumptions that I believe have woven themselves into the assessment of needs. And I think it's important that we start with the needs and then go tackle some other topics. Because we had talked last night about types of housing. We had boards where we would pick types of housing we wanted, or accommodations that we'd like to give to developers to lower cost. We talked about mixed use being our favored type of housing, and I think that's premature. I want to follow up on your comment, Commissioner Moline, and Commissioner Howe's comments, and about getting a more granular look at what we can handle as a community and what our needs are. I think that's super important because this is a local, it's going to affect us locally. We want to be part of the solution, but we need to know what exactly our problem, how we can fit best in there. And one reason I think this is super important is because I just rented a house. And so my goal was to get someone in a helping profession. So I priced it pretty low relative to what it was. A good quality house, and I got floods and floods of applicants. One thing I noticed that many are from out of state. So is that the crisis we're trying to solve, that everyone who wants to move here or decides they want to move here for whatever reason should find housing? The other thing I found is that many people were fleeing impersonal housing where you have a manager and you have like fees, and it's very impersonal. They wanted to have someone that they could relate to, and I feel like that's very well within our values as a community of Louisville. Like, we want to be a community. We don't want to be a place where people just get warehoused. And I'd like to look at these issues through the lens of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, because those are our values as a city, and see if we take the assumption that the other assumption that I've heard a lot and that I'm kind of hearing is that we need more housing. That's the assumption. More is going to solve our problem. So I want to look at these assumptions through the lens of DEI and then say, well, what are some alternatives? So diversity. I don't think we can build our way out of the diversity problem, because say you have housing and you say, well, 30% has to be for affordability. Well, that leaves 2/3 of it that's not. To me, that looks like we're going to be more and more polarized. This is why I left Boulder, because you have super rich people on one end, and then you have like not people who are not doing very well, or like a little few remnants of the middle class. So I don't think that percentage of housing is very good at all. I really don't think that model of building a lot of houses with that in mind is good. Equity. Is this going to be good for people? I liked Rob's comment that we want to think of the life cycle of people who come here, not just say, do we have boxes? Check. You got into a box. Well, hope you like it for a long time. I lived in affordable housing, and I felt like was kind of felt stigmatized. Also, like, people treated me differently when they knew I lived there. So I feel like we need to build housing or have housing that people just feel like they're just people, because they are just people. Like, income doesn't make us different, and that's how we need to treat people. So I think we should consider the life cycle. Inclusion. Just building housing is not going to create inclusion. Like, people were talking last night about, well, what about Cinnabar? It's like, to me, that says other side of the tracks, or here you go, you can live by the highway. We could build units, we can check a box, but I don't know that that's what we as a community say, like, hey, I care about people and I care about my community. What do we do that's quality? So some of the ideas that I did were more attractive to me were like the idea of ADUs. So you're building those in existing neighborhoods as they can be accommodated. How about incentivizing landlords? Like, I did it voluntarily, but how about we incentivize landlords to charge lower rents and say, hey, I want to find people in the helping professions. And I found great renters, by the way. They're amazing. And they're super happy because they're going to be in a neighborhood, in a nice place. We need to protect existing affordable housing. There's a lot of scraping and popping and just changing what we have into much more expensive housing. How about we think, could we acquire some of those houses in neighborhoods so people are integrated into our community like they always have been? Not they, like we always have been. I don't want to talk about us and them, because I've lived in plenty of types of housing myself. We need to think about what's the cost to existing homeowners, because if we're talking about these developer incentives, well, what's that going to cost us? My insurance has gone way up, and then our property taxes are going to go way up. And we don't want to make people who live here, who can currently afford to live here, not able to.
Sherry,
Am I done?
I'm so sorry. Yeah,
Oh, I'm
no,
so
but
sorry.
you
I
don't, you don't
didn't
have,
see there
don't,
was
no,
no,
I know. Don't stop right away, but if you could wrap
Oh,
up.
I just want to say,
wrap
like,
up.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't see any numbers, so I was like, I'll just keep talking. Oh, thanks. Oh, I'm sorry, Rob. People are like, is she ever going to stop? We hear a lot about a crisis in housing. I'll tell you what a crisis is. A crisis is when your town is burning down and you're about to lose water, and the Public Works Department goes in and makes sure that your whole town doesn't burn down. This is a high priority, and we need to treat it like a high priority, and we need to think long term. We have to get rid of the crisis mentality, because that's not the right thinking for housing. Thank you.
Okay, we have a comment card.
Thank
also.
you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Next one is Kathan Smith. Pardon the pronunciation.
I believe it's Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. I really just have a question, and it might just be the labeling, but early in the presentation, there's a slide where you're showing the residents by sort of describing their families, you know, young people, and when you get to the elderly, you just have an elderly couple. I happen to be a widow, and so I'm like, oh, am I not on this chart? Am I not part of the population? Am I invisible? And then I started to think a little bit more about it and realized that women tend to survive their spouses. And so are we overlooking a whole segment of people, or do we just have a labeling issue? Thanks.
Okay, we have a third comment card. Cindy Bedell.
One thing I like about this town, I can get off my bike and show up looking like this, unpretentious small town. So I have something I'd like to say, a few things. So even though we will never be able to accommodate all the thousands of new people who want to move to Louisville, we should do what we can to increase our affordable housing. This conversation needs to be not just about building new housing, but retaining more affordable housing stock, such as creative programs like legacy deed restrictions, like they have in the city of Boulder, to pass along a more affordable house as permanently affordable, restricting the size of rebuilds on scrape-offs, and offering incentives to property owners to maintain and or rent at a lower rate smaller houses. So our design overlay study should be for the entire city, not just the downtown. And building new units, we need to consider how much increase in population the city can sustain. At what point will we have additional infrastructure burdens such as rec center, police, fire, roads, library, downtown parking, crowding on trails and local events? Increased density equals increased traffic and a change in the neighborhood character. Segregated large housing projects are not a good fit for small town Louisville or for the social integration of our communities. I hope we won't end up with blocks of brutality architecture, 3- and 4-story projects like in East Boulder or Superior. And then tonight I was listening to the consultant, which I appreciated this very interesting study. But I'm curious, you know, what sample size and sample technique did these consultants use to come up with the statements that were made tonight? Like, oh yeah, the community wants ADUs, we want infill, we want rebuilding, we want TOD and housing close to transportation, and their support for additional density to support affordability. I don't hear that when I talk to people. So I'd like to see a community-wide, statistically valid study, not just a biased sample from a few people that came to an open house. So my question is, should the housing study drive the comp plan, or should the comp plan drive the housing? And I have a couple other questions. So live-work statistics. So there's a lot of talk about multi-use and live-work, but I've heard the statistics are actually quite low. How many people who live in a multi-use, high-density development actually work within walking distance or nearby in the same community? I've heard statistics under 8%, but I'd like to know what the actual figures are. And yes, I agree, new housing and housing density infill needs to preserve the character of the neighborhood. As far as ADUs, when I was right out of grad school in Cleveland, I saw some beautiful carriage houses on acre lots downtown. And I think in Louisville, ADUs could be appropriate in some places with large lots. But I think it's appropriate to have something reasonable so we don't have backyard granny flats and these tiny lots with big houses and then another house behind it. So I think some kind of reasonable footprint or lot requirement. And even if you're creating an EDU from a basement or a garage bonus room, that creates more people and more parking problems and changes the social fabric of a neighborhood. So I lived next to a rental with 4 unrelated young adults at one point, and it was really fun. I got a lot of free herbal benefits living downwind, but it became a problem with parking. And 4 people, 3 or 4 people or ADUs are going to create a lot more pressure on our parking and a lot more traffic. Only a couple other points. So I'm curious what percentage of our Louisville housing is attached, not single family detached. I hear a lot about we have too much single family and we need to be more inclusive and have more attached. But I think we're over 30% already attached housing. And I don't think we need to be careful not to confuse high density with affordability. I hear that a lot over the last few years. But a lot of this new high density development is more expensive than some of our small single family homes. So for example, the new townhouses on Griffith, that whole area, they were selling, I don't know what they are now, but they were selling $790, $890, much more than my tiny little house. So let's not confuse that. So in summary, I support increasing affordable housing in a reasonable, creative way that doesn't change our community quality of life and small town character. Thank you.
Chair Brown, I think that's it for the room. There is one person online. Hand's not currently raised. It's *9 if you're on a phone, and then you can use the raise hand button if you'd like to speak. Okay, so that might be it for public comment.
Chair Bronice, do you see that Commissioner Howe has his hand raised?
If the questions come back around to the commissioners, I would entertain a few more for the Echo West group, but not until then.
Well,
So,
maybe.
Chair Bronice, you are still muted if you're hearing us. So while maybe, oh, here we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Commissioner Howe, please go ahead with your questions.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for letting me have another round of questions here. And I guess, is it okay, Chairman Brown Eyes, if I direct some questions to the Echo West group again? Is that in the correct order here?
Echo Northwest, yep.
Echo Northwest. Great. Okay, so maybe Tyler, I could direct some more questions to you. There's so many questions I have. I guess I want to touch on the ADUs just a little bit more. And I know that these proposals haven't come before Louisville yet. So I just wanted to get some general feedback from you about how this could impact your housing study here. And just, if you could just help me walk through, and I really do genuinely appreciate your feedback on this, because what I think I understand with ADUs may actually not be accurate, but help me understand what the impacts of allowing or approving or extending the ADUs in Louisville would be. Here's my understanding, and correct me where I'm incorrect. So it seems like it increases the housing availability, which is one thing that we're trying to do. It increases the population. It increases the demand in infrastructure. It increases school attendance, which would be good. It increases revenue for maybe taxes purposes, and it also increase average home price because now you have larger housing units that are bigger and providing to renters. So I'm wondering how this affects what in other communities, how you've seen that affect housing demand.
Great questions, Commissioner. Very big questions. ADU allowances differ all over the country for jurisdictions that allow them, and the regulations that a community allows is up to the community of what that looks like. I've worked in communities that have ADU allowances that are for very small backyard units or attached units that are under 500 square feet. I've worked in communities that allow two-story ADUs in a backyard up to 900 square feet, and it really depends on what the housing need the community is that's trying to reach or what you're trying to meet, and what those regulations look like. So it's very diverse. If you have questions on ADUs or anybody really, there's a really great resource that AARP has actually made available called the ABCs of ADUs. And it has a lot of great case study research from communities across the country that have implemented ADU regulations in different ways, and some of the ways to sort of mitigate against potential impacts depending on the community's concerns. So as a place to start, I would sort of point you towards that AARP report. They also have a great report on a model ADU code for anybody that's interested on the regulatory side of it. But it really differs, and it differs between the market too, between what happens in one housing market is very different than in another housing market. But and also to sort of emphasize that we're not yet at the point of making recommendations as part of the strategy. We're still in the sort of existing conditions phase. The information that we shared earlier was the key themes from the 80 attendance at the open house yesterday. It was by no means a recommendation of policies as part of this plan. So a lot more work to do, and a lot of other resources out there. But AARP is a great one for ADU resources.
And I have so many questions, but I'll try to hit the most important ones. I want to go back to affordable housing if possible with you. One of the struggles that I think Louisville has, which I'm sure you've seen before, is how you define the range of income required to allow participants to be part of the affordable housing. And I look at your cost burden chart, and I just wonder, the cost of living this is something that is difficult for us because our cost of living is high in this area. And I think that makes a larger burden on our affordable housing, our ability to provide and engage affordable housing tenants or owners. So what's worked in different communities it seems like, in my opinion, I guess what I'm getting at is, it seems like that range is too high. We're requiring people to have too high of an income to afford these affordable housing units. How do we lower that range? How do we lower that so that more people with maybe lower incomes can afford these affordable housing units? This quote unquote affordable housing units, right? We need these to be affordable, but with our cost of living so high, it's difficult.
Yeah, that is the sort of long-term perennial affordable housing finance challenge. When we think about affordable housing needs, there's different policy approaches to different income levels. So you might think about a policy or a program approach for very low income households that are 0 to 30% AMI. That looks very different than if you're thinking about what an approach is for workforce housing between 80 and 120% AMI. So there's different policy approaches. There's different ways to think about programs and funding. HUD has different program funding available that sort of treats different income categories differently as well. And I think if the goal is to say, how do we meet the housing need of more very low income households, and then you'd want to sort of focus in on what are the opportunities and prioritize resources in that 0 to 30, 30 to 50% AMI
Right.
category. So there's it's around priorities, allocation of scarce resources, and both the policy and the program interventions there.
And if I could add something to that as well, Tyler mentioned workforce housing is often defined as 80 to 120% of AMI. We've had some discussions here in the county because, like we saw, the housing costs are so high that some people are starting to talk about workforce housing as being 60 to 80%, or there are working, clearly working, hardworking families, single parents, and two income families that are falling into that 60 to 80% and lower AMI and are struggling to pay for housing. So I think when we talk about workforce housing in a very expensive region like we're in, we need to think about broadening our definition.
I have one more question, and it's about our fee in lieu. And I'd like your feedback on how successful you think that is for creating affordable housing. Are you familiar with our fee in lieu rules and regulations in Louisville?
So I'll take that on. I don't know
Okay.
if the consultants have really dug into that yet.
Okay.
And the fee in lieu is set. We have a formula that we followed other communities in our region on how to determine a fee in lieu, which is meant to create funds, not to buy a whole affordable housing unit, but it's the delta between that affordability, that 60 or 80%, and what a market rate unit would cost. So that subsidizes the cost of a unit. Our inclusionary housing ordinance has a very strong preference for actually building within the neighborhood rather than taking fee in lieu. However, we can take fee in lieu, and we just had a project come through that was approved for fee in lieu. There's pros and cons to building within the neighborhood versus fee in lieu. Talking to some of our neighboring communities that do more affordable housing development, they're not completely opposed to the fee in lieu compared to the building it within the different neighborhoods and communities, when those are being built, because you can leverage that money also. So you might be getting that fee in lieu that creates the difference in cost. You could go out and buy one unit with that, right? And that should theoretically provide the subsidy you need. But you could also take that money and work with the housing authority or work with Prop 123 and try to leverage that money to build even more. So, but then those homes aren't necessarily integrated into the community as well either. So there's some cons to that. So that's kind of a long-winded way to answer your question, I hope.
Well, yeah, I am familiar with the fee in lieu, I guess. And I guess maybe there's not a question there for Tyler, so I should apologize. I guess we're just trying to get some feedback. I wish that program was more successful at integrating affordable housing. And I just wonder how we can make that more successful. It seems like the fee in lieu circumvents some of the original goals of our affordable housing to certain projects. So I guess I'll just throw that out there as a comment rather than maybe a question.
Additional questions, additional comments? Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm all done.
Oh,
I've got one, if that's okay.
please.
Yeah, I want to ask 1,000 follow-up questions on what Commissioner Howe's asking, but I think that I want to kind of back up, and I'm wondering if in this meeting we could come up with additional data that we really need, that we want to see to make these decisions. I kind of want to back up and understand what our goals are a little bit. we heard, I don't know, maybe a year ago, a draft ordinance on rezoning and creating additional requirements for affordable housing for areas that are rezoned. And we tabled the discussion because we felt like we needed more data. And I'm not sure that I see I know that that wasn't posed to you, but I'm wondering if we could ask if we could ask Echo Northwest for the data that we need to answer that question. And I think some of those, I can jump in and talk about some of those data points that I thought we needed, but it looks like Rob's got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that is in the scope for this, and at least the way we scope this within this project is, if we're going to have an inclusionary ordinance, most communities put incentives in to get even more affordable housing. So our baseline's 12%, and there was some discussion about, well, should we go up to a higher percentage? Well, if we go up to 25% and we don't include incentives, we're going to get zero, because we're going to it's not going to be a feasible project from a financial standpoint if we go too high. So what we've asked Echo Northwest and their team to do is to do some financial analysis in the market of, if we allow this density bonus, what does that do to the pro forma for a project? And so can we find that kind of Goldilocks sweet spot, at least at this moment in time, of what we think is the most impactful incentive that a developer will take advantage of. So that might be, you can go, if you give us, instead of 12, if you give us 15 or 20% deed restricted affordable housing, we'll give you additional density or additional height or reduce the parking requirement, or, we need to reach out to the development community, and that's part of this input process too, to say, what is meaningful to you? If we ask you to give us more affordable housing, what can we give you in return as an incentive? So that is embedded into this process. If you think there's some data that might be helpful, we'd love to hear that this evening as well.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't sure about that. Yeah, one of the things I was wondering is, just a small data point in there, is if we considered the rezoning value when you take a commercial property and rezone it to residential, how much is the value of that property going to increase? And would that be part of the incentive? Because currently we only have, I think I remember from a different presentation, we only have residential zoning to add about 400 units in Louisville. So if we want to have more than 400 additional units, we have to rezone. And so what is the difference in the value of a property that gets rezoned from commercial to residential? I think that would be an important data point, and I'm not sure if you mentioned that already as part of the incentives, but I'd be interested in that one. And then I was just kind of had a list of things that I thought we also needed besides that ordinance. I was really curious about the demographic data of the people, especially when you're talking about the people who are housing cost burdened. I know that some people, some of our public comments were asking about the broader question: what are our values and how do we want to help people who want to move in? But apparently we have people who are here who are already housing cost burdened. So are they doctors in their residency who overburden themselves so that they can, anticipating a balloon in their income? Or are they single parents? Are they people who speak other language? Are they disabled vets who have a very fixed income and will not be seeing their income increase, but will see prices going up? So I'm kind of curious about who are those. It looked like who are the, I think it was 23% of renters who are housing cost burdened. I wanted some more detail on them so that we could, how can we help the people who already live in Louisville?
That's a really good question. The data that's available, I'm going to get really technical for a second. For us to bifurcate that cost burden data to sort of cross-tabulate with some of that demographic data requires us to use a data set that's called PUMS data. That's a much larger geographic area. So it would more represent the county than Louisville specifically. So we could cross-tab that data and understand what's happening in the county, but that's still not going to be able to tell us what's happening in Louisville because of the margin of error associated with that data when you start to get to those small sample sizes. I can tell you that the households that are most housing secure, that are most cost burdened across the country, are households of color, are households, low-income households, households with less than a bachelor's degree of education, and LGBTQ households. Those are the households that are most vulnerable to displacement. There's been a ton of research out there that's all found the same thing. So consistently, those are the households that are most vulnerable to displacement. And so if we're thinking about DEI, those populations are most vulnerable.
So are you recommending that we just use this general knowledge to inform our strategies, or that we don't need more specific, we can't get and we don't need more specific information for Louisville? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is the data is very challenging to get at that individual level that's been requested. But what we can do is look and see what data is available to get to more detail to answer your question for you. But the data is really challenging at that level.
Yeah, so it's like, it's not part of, it would probably be impossible to do a survey of, identify these houses and do a survey of their needs.
Yeah, doing a door-to-door survey across, I mean, you'd have to talk to every single individual to get a sample size. It's really challenging to get that data.
Thank you.
It's something that I wish that I had.
Additional questions?
Chair, I have a question.
Please go ahead.
I'm feeling as a new commissioner like I need more basic statistics. So Tamar commented that we have 400 additional units allowed, residential units allowed under current zoning. I don't know where that information is coming from, and I've been wondering if this study will produce data that says how much land is available for new housing. I understand that's only one part of the strategy, possibly. So Rob, it looks like you might want to answer.
Yeah, so that's an estimate from city planning staff, that 400, and we acknowledge it's a range, and it's based on currently zoned property that have by right zoning, not what we call, our conditional use, special review use zoning. So these are by right properties that include, the Foundry property, which is the Steel Ranch mixed-use commercial hub. It's the North End commercial mixed-use hub off of South Boulder Road. It includes portions of Delo. It includes, and we can get you more detailed information. It includes the Coal Creek Village, formerly called Coal Creek Station development, south of South Boulder Road, north of Delo, that kind of infill development there. So those are really the properties that have by right residential zoning in the city. So if we make some assumptions, you might be looking at 350 to 450 units that could be built out based on how they're currently zoned. How much property is available for new residential development outside of that? I think that depends on if the city wants to change its land use policies and zoning to create new properties. Or we do have lots of properties that have the special review use zoning that are, the base zoning is commercial, but they allow residential or mixed use residential through special review use. We could not change that zoning, but change our policies to say that we would promote it in certain areas that have the SRU. Our current policies, which include the comprehensive plan, the South Boulder Road small area plan, and the Chasm small area plan, when I say policies, I'm primarily talking about those documents. They don't suggest that any of those commercially zoned, but where you're allowed through SRU, they don't have policies that support residential on those properties. So it's a policy alignment. And I think there was an intention when those when those plans were adopted to not support residential development on those commercial properties with SRU. That's what they say. So that's the policies we've set, and I think additional land could be designated through the comprehensive plan process, which would then call for potentially rezoning properties to allow residential. So, yeah.
That's helpful.
Yep.
So an outcome of this study, a recommendation could be to rezone properties through the comprehensive plan for additional housing.
Yes, I think that could be a potential strategy that could come out of this report. And then the comprehensive, that's where I've been talking about. Then you really get into the comprehensive plan where you then have to talk more specifically about it.
And then furthermore, enacting laws based on the comp plan. Any additional questions, thoughts? Seeing none?
You're muted, Commissioner Howe.
Can I ask one more, Chairman?
And I have one more
Sure,
too
go
after
ahead.
that.
I recognize, Tyler, that our comp plan, as it was alluded to before, may drive some of these answers to the housing. But in the past comp plans, there have been some priorities that the residents have valued, such as lifestyle and parks and open space and schools and these other things. So let me go from my question from another angle. If the comp plan upholds some of these values and desires, and we know that, as Rob alluded to, the square acreage of Louisville is limited. We're a small town, a small municipality. What has been successful in other communities to integrate? Well, I guess we just talked about affordable housing right now. Integrate affordable housing with these ideas in mind. We have a finite acreage. We want to maybe maintain, if the comp plan says we want to maintain existing proportions of parks, open space, schools, etc., residences. How do you do that? Does the city go in and buy places that they want to create affordable? How does that, walk me through that, how that works?
There's lots of different approaches, and frankly, it usually takes many different approaches.
Okay.
But what you just mentioned is acquisition, and acquisition is an important strategy. So essentially acquiring existing, what we would call naturally occurring affordable housing. So housing that is currently below market rates, but is not subsidized or deed restricted. And that is one of the most efficient ways, frankly, to maintain long-term affordability. That requires resources, but there's strategies, there's funding through HUD available to do acquisition and rehab to do that. So yes, that's one of the strategies. But I think, the city's inclusionary housing ordinance, to make sure that you do get some affordable housing or some fee out of new development, is a good way to do that as well. And it's, it takes a lot of different strategies to be able to get there.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Additional questions?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to clarify a little bit more what the goals are besides achieving the 12% at doing our part for the county. I just heard a lot of implied goals as we go along, but I was wondering if that was something that could be listed really clearly. I didn't see a slide on that, but some of the things where, do we lack teachers and firefighters because they can't afford to live here? I wanted to try to find out what the problem was.
Right,
And then what the goal is. Is the big problem that we can't get teachers and firefighters? Because maybe the problem is a BVSD issue and how they pay salaries and not, whether we have affordable housing. Just an example. And do we have businesses that can't get employees because of lack of housing? And how do we know that? These are I have all these questions, and I think that the questions are still just defining the problem before because I'm on the opposite side of where Commissioner Howe is, I guess. He's asking all these great questions about how we could solve these problems, but I'm still kind of really behind the 8 ball on what exactly our problem is. And so I'm kind of a visual person too, and one of the things that would really help me to see things, well, one would be to list of what the problems are in Louisville and then what our goals are to solve them. I didn't really see that clear enough just for me I think it was an amazing presentation. I learned so much, and I have a list of all the things I wanted to say that I learned that are new. But being expedient, I have some questions about the problems. And then another thing is, I have another specific data question that I would like to see.
Can I answer your first question
Sure.
before we get to the data
Yeah.
question? So, and we knew that coming to you at this very early stage in the process could raise your question about the question. What are the questions? Because we're in that is the whole point of this, is to agree as a community what the problem is, to set that baseline. So this is the very beginning steps of starting to ask that question. So the idea is that we're getting all this great data, and we're all going to have to try to figure out how can we all make sense of this? And then how can we as a community determine what is the problem? What are we trying to achieve from a housing standpoint? It's going to be a difficult question. It's going to be a difficult discussion because there's going to be a lot of different opinions. But we're very hopeful that we can come to some consensus amongst the community and the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council about, okay, here are the issues that we see, and this data is just the beginning of that, so we can be as informed as possible. We're probably never going to have all of the data that we want, but hopefully we get enough data so we feel like we have enough data to make reasonably informed decisions to define the problem. So that's our goal. And so we wanted to familiarize the Planning Commission with the process and the data and kind of set the stage for the discussions that are going to be happening over the next few months, where hopefully we can start answering that question. We have heard, can we find definitive data that school teachers and firefighters can't afford to live here? That's hard to quantify. We have lots of great census data and other things. That's why we do community outreach too, and we interview people and we do stakeholder interviews. I have heard personally from many, many businesses that we are having trouble recruiting employees. That includes service employees. It also includes very highly paid engineering positions in the tech center. Their employees are frustrated. They're frustrated because there's no affordable housing. They want to locate here, and they're having trouble recruiting. A lot of our service businesses on McCaslin, I've heard directly from many of them, we can't find people to work here. They're having to reduce their hours, and that affects the services we have available to us, but it affects those small local businesses. It affects their ability to make a living, because if they can't stay open, they can't make a living, and our small local businesses can't thrive and survive. So housing's really fundamental to some of those things.
And that's really helpful, and those are the kind of questions I would be really helpful to see, like a list of what these things are, and then to figure out where they are priority-wise as far as problems to solve. I understand it's really hard to get a statistic on, how many businesses can't find employees, but as much data as we can have on that kind of thing would be helpful to us understanding how to develop the right kind of strategies. And then the other question I had was, if it's okay, I'll wait. No, does anybody else mind if I continue? Okay,
Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'm a visual kind of thinker, I guess, and so I'm visualizing the time period now and the time period 2035 when we want to reach a 12% goal. And I like to see numbers, so I'm kind of imagining that if we do no changes in policy and we have all the new units are built affordable, well, when we build the next 400, I'm sorry, I didn't explain where the 400 number came from, but we came with that we'd end up with 48, I think, new affordable units. But we have a deficit that would leave us with a deficit of about 850 more. So I'd like to see on that timeline, what would Louisville look like in 2035? In my opinion and understanding, we have 8,000 housing units approximately in Louisville, and that would, at the 12% rate, it would take us another 7,500 units to get to 12% overall affordable. So that would double the size of Louisville. So not doing interventions wouldn't work. So I'd like to see a visual of how Louisville looks if we follow some different policy options, just with some numbers. If we said every household could have an ADU, that would give us, how many ADUs, how many single, you know what I mean? Or we said 25% of houses had ADUs. I'd kind of like to see how that plays out for our population, for our affordable housing percentage between now and 2035. I don't know, it's just kind of something that I'm looking for in my head and I'm trying to draw out myself, but I don't have the numbers. Does that question make sense?
the question makes sense. It's a little bit of a big ask at the individual level of like, what happens if we do ADUs? What happens if we do this thing? But what we can do is sort of show what that 12% is now, where the affordable housing is now, and what that looks like if you don't build as much over time. Because you're just, I mean, Rob mentioned earlier, there's 350 affordable housing units. That means that you need to build 500 to 600 affordable housing units just to meet your 12% target today. And so, you know, there's, like you mentioned, there's a deficit, and that deficit is pretty large to get to 12%, not accounting for any future growth that's going to be happening. So we will articulate, communicate what that goal means, and I think we can do it in a visual chart sort of format. We'll have to see what we can do for you.
And acquisition's hard. I know we talked a little bit about acquisition. When you look at that, and I emailed that to all of you, by the way, so the 2017 county housing strategy, but they talk a lot about what it would take to achieve, and it talks about building and acquisition. So just to be clear, there has to be a and I think we probably can't emphasize this enough. Like, we can't just build ADUs. We can't just have inclusionary. We can't just have an acquisition program. I think to be successful, we have to think about, I mean, it's a really multi-pronged approach is really critical. Because yes, I think if you look at any one individual initiative, you'll get overwhelmed and say, we'll never achieve our goals just with that one initiative. But I think if you start building little bits and pieces, we'll get closer to our goal. And I think as we've been talking about this internally, we've been really, we really want to emphasize that we have to look at this holistically.
Great, thank you. Any other simmering questions as we move forward? Actually, refreshing us on the timeline. When is Eco Northwest going to be back with us?
We don't have an exact timeline. I could follow up with the commission and send you all an email. I think we're gonna, once we got through this first round of comment, we'll circle back with them and start talking about next steps and upcoming engagement with the community and the commission, and we'll let you know more specifically via email.
Great, thank you. Any other additional questions? Seeing none, excuse me, we'll go ahead and close this portion of the meeting, if that's okay. It's really hard to sense it from here, but seems like it's okay. All right. Thank you all. And then in closing, though, we'll open it up just to commissioner comments, and then we'll have staff comments and adjourn. Any commissioner comments? Seeing none, hearing none. Staff comments.
No further comments. I really appreciate everybody's time. This was a special meeting date, and I appreciate the overtime for our group of volunteers here. We'll make sure to pay you time and a half. And looking forward to kind of continuing this conversation with everybody here. I think we're off to a really great start, and appreciate everybody's time and input.
Definitely, and I would echo that as well. Thanks to everybody for showing up. With that, then, motion to adjourn. I don't think we have to be formal, actually. I'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.